Louis XIV was often hailed as the most stunning king in European history. With a perfect physique and almost godlike charisma, he could dance ballet for 6 straight hours without breaking a sweat. Foreign ambassadors were completely captivated by his presence. This king spoke 5 languages fluently and could even recall the names of 3,000 nobles from his court. However, what history tends to hide is the shocking truth about his downfall. The king who built the most magnificent palace in the world ultimately died a grotesque 310-pound figure, decaying and toothless, riddled with gangrene. His own courtiers had to wear perfumed masks just to endure his stench, which was so unbearable that foreign diplomats physically recoiled during royal meetings. I've uncovered hidden medical records that reveal the gruesome truth about how this once glorified king became a decaying corpse, facts that French historians tried to bury for over 450 years. If this is news to you, hit that like button so others can discover what really happened behind the grand palace walls. Now, get ready, because I'm about to unveil 3 horrifying medical secrets that will forever change your perception of European royalty. Imagine this: May 6, 1661, at the Palace of Versailles. The 23-year-old Louis XIV descends the marble staircase adorned in a ceremonial robe weighing 33 pounds, embroidered with real gold thread. The 5,000-member audience holds their breath as this 5'8" king, with rippling muscles and jet-black hair, passes by Venetian mirrors, reflecting his flawless physique. The sun streams through crystal windows, bathing him in golden light, while he truly embodies divine perfection. His commanding voice could be heard clearly from 150 feet away. His deep blue eyes were said to be like shooting stars piercing straight into your soul. As he walked, his confident stride caused the very hardwood floors of Versailles to vibrate. His natural scent was so intoxicating that both men and women would swoon as he passed. But this perfect image was far from the future that awaited him. What many don't know is that Louis wasn't just a pretty face with royal blood. He was a force of nature. By the time he was 20, he could out-fence the finest Italian swordsman. He would dance ballet for 6 hours straight without tiring, then write poetry so moving that even the cold-hearted British ambassador wept upon hearing it performed at court. His physical abilities were nearly superhuman. Court records show that he consumed 4 full meals and 3 snacks every day while maintaining a muscular build. He'd hunt wild boar for 8 hours, then dance until 300 am without showing any signs of exhaustion. His memory was extraordinary. He could remember the names of over 3,000 nobles and recall personal details about their families. His legendary appetite extended beyond food. He was reported to maintain intimate relationships with at least 12 different women every month. Foreign diplomats were captivated by his almost supernatural charisma. When Louis XIV entered a room, conversation stopped, hearts raced, and even his political enemies found themselves mesmerized by him. This was the height of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV was its epitome. Every morning, over 100 nobles would literally fight for the honor of handing him his silk shirt during the famous lever ceremony. They'd argue over who got to hold his mirror, pour his washing water, and even tie his shoes. The evening coucher was another spectacle, with grown men competing to blow out his bedside candle. The Palace of Versailles itself was designed as a stage for this divine performance. 10,000 courtiers attended daily, with every movement carefully choreographed for maximum impact. When Louis walked through the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection seemed to multiply his godlike presence. But even in this golden age, there were hints of what was to come. Court records, revealed only in 87, exposed troubling signs of his declining health. By the time Louis was 25, he needed 2 daily enemas just to pass a bowel movement due to chronic constipation. This was the result of compulsive overeating, where he consumed 6 to 8 meals a day. His breath had become so foul that he relied on peppermint candies to mask the stench. His skin was oily and acne-scarred, hidden beneath layers of thick white powder. Court records also show that he suffered from severe digestive issues that required daily medical attention. Yet these flaws were carefully hidden from the public, masked by elaborate court rituals meant to present weakness as a divine ritual. The most alarming issue was Louis XIV's complete refusal to bathe. He would wash his hands and face every morning, but that was all. His entire body was rarely cleaned, only 2 times in his entire life. While it may have been common in the era, Louis XIV's decision to avoid water stemmed from the medieval belief that it weakened the body and opened doors for evil spirits. Louis truly believed that his natural body odour was a sign of his masculinity and divine power. Unfortunately, this fatal choice would set in motion the horrifying decay that consumed him. By January 1686, something sinister began growing in the darkest, dampest part of his body, and what began as vanity would soon turn the Sun King into a grotesque, decaying figure. On January 15, 1686, Louis, now 47, summoned his personal physician, complaining of a small discomfort while sitting. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, who had a reputation for killing more patients than the Black Death, quickly diagnosed it as simple hemorrhoids. But this was no ordinary issue. It marked the beginning of a 30-year nightmare that would destroy the Sun King from the inside out. Within a week, that minor discomfort turned into excruciating pain, like a red-hot dagger with every movement. By January 22nd, the swelling had grown to the size of a walnut, and by January 28th there was constant bleeding, forcing Louis to sit on soft cushions during meetings. Then on February 5th, servants first reported a strange foul odour coming from the royal garments. By February 12th, pus and fecal matter were draining continuously through an external opening near his rectum. Imagine the most disgusting infection you've ever witnessed, then multiply that horror by 100. That was the reality for Europe's most powerful king. The stench was unbearable, following him wherever he went. Dr. Fagan's medieval treatments were nothing short of barbaric. The king was subjected to multiple freezing cold water enemas every single day. Over the next 6 months, court records show that Louis endured over 2,000 enemas as Fagan desperately tried to cleanse his body. When that failed, Fagan escalated the treatment to red-hot iron cauterization. Metal rods were heated until they glowed, then pressed into the infected flesh. The king was held down by courtiers, his screams echoing through the palace, yet the infection only worsened. As a final measure, Louis was subjected to daily bloodletting, 500 millilitres drained from his body each day to purify his corrupted essence. But nothing worked. Desperate remedies surfaced, prescribed by charlatans promising miraculous cures: bull sperm mixed with wine, bull's blood and crushed pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy. Each treatment was more revolting and ineffective than the last, yet Louis submitted to all of them, determined to maintain his image. By November 1686, the situation had become impossible to conceal. The stench was so overpowering that foreign diplomats began finding excuses to avoid seeing the king. Something drastic needed to be done, and that something would be one of the most horrifying medical procedures in royal history. Enter Charles Francois Felix, the royal surgeon, who would either save the Sun King or kill him in the attempt. Felix knew that operating on the most powerful monarch in Europe, without anesthesia or proper surgical knowledge, was a death sentence. He prepared for this moment in the most disturbing way possible, by practicing on 75 condemned prisoners and volunteers. Every week for months he performed operations on living human beings who had no choice but to endure the agony. Felix designed a special curved silver scalpel called listorial, made specifically to carve into the most private parts of the Sun King's body. On November 18th, 1686, the day that would change everything, Felix's surgical team secretly entered Louis XIV's chambers. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief, only 4 trusted courtiers to hold the king down and a piece of wood for him to bite on during the worst moments. The procedure lasted 3 hours of excruciating conscious torture that would have broken lesser men. Felix began cutting with his royal scalpel, slicing through the infected tissue as Louis remained awake, fully aware of every incision. The stench that filled the room when the abscess was cut open was so revolting that 2 assistants had to flee, vomiting uncontrollably. Blood sprayed across the silk bedsheets in a horrific burst, staining them crimson. As the king bit down on the wooden block, the pain intensified, and Felix cut deeper, removing gangrenous tissue that had turned black with rot. At 9:15 a.m., when the scalpel reached the tailbone, Louis XIV let out a scream of pure agony, shouting "Mon Dieu" for the first time. His scream echoed throughout 3 floors of the palace. Felix's secret medical notes, hidden for 300 years and only discovered in 2007, describe extracting more than 200 mermels of blue-green pus that smelled like decaying corpses. The infected tissue was removed in chunks, exposing bone that had been eaten away by the constant flow of decay. But the nightmare wasn't over. After those agonizing 3 hours, Felix declared the surgery complete, but there was a horrifying revelation: the wound wouldn't heal. The infection had spread too deep and the damage to the tissue was too severe. Louis XIV would need not 1 but 4 separate surgeries. The second operation came on December 6th, the third on December 8th, and the fourth, the most brutal of all, took place on December 10th. 6 hours of cutting, with Louis awake through it all, his body held down by 6 men. Felix performed what can only be called butchery. In total, the surgery stretched over 15 hours, spread across 3 weeks. The amount of infected tissue removed was enough to fill a large wine bowl. The pain Louis endured was beyond comprehension, and yet the wound continued to drain, to reek, and to rot away the Sun King from the inside. When the surgeries finally ended and the wound began to show signs of healing, court physicians declared it a miracle. But what they didn't realize was that they had created something far worse than just a medical issue. They had transformed Louis XIV into a man whose body would never stop decomposing, whose stench would become legendary, and whose physical decay would require increasingly desperate measures to hide it from the prying eyes of Europe. By March 1687, the surgical wounds had healed, but they had left behind something far more horrifying: a permanent anal fistula that would cause feces and pus to leak continuously for the rest of Louis XIV's life. The once glorious Sun King, known for his intoxicating natural scent, now emitted the unmistakable odour of death. This transformation was swift and devastating. Foreign diplomats, who had once fought for an audience with the king, now made every effort to avoid him. The Venetian ambassador secretly reported that being near the French king was like stepping into a charnel house. The stench was not just unpleasant, it was overpowering, nauseating, and impossible to ignore. Louis XIV, in his desperation, embarked on what can only be described as the most expensive perfume revolution in history. He spent the modern equivalent of $2 million each year on fragrances imported from every corner of the world: Bulgarian roses, Arabian amber, Indian sandalwood. No price was too high to mask the smell of his decaying body. The palace itself became a massive perfume machine. Fresh flowers were replaced every 2 hours throughout Versailles, and specialized containers known as castlets continuously burned scented smoke in every room the king might enter. Servants were tasked with spraying furniture with perfume before Louis sat down. Even the food was infused with aromatic oils to try to hide the smell of his breath. But no amount of fragrance could conceal the reality of what was happening to his body. The trauma from multiple surgeries and his inability to exercise properly caused his weight to balloon, horrifying even his most loyal supporters. From 165 pounds in 1670, Louis XIV grew to 2 pounds by 1700, and then to a shocking 310 pounds by 1710. The once graceful king now required 6 strong men to lift him onto his horse, and his throne had to be rebuilt 3 times because he outgrew it. Court portraitists were instructed to paint him from angles that hid his massive bulk. But foreign visitors weren't fooled. A Russian ambassador bluntly remarked that the French king smelled worse than my horse and moved like a pregnant cow. Then in 1693 came the dental catastrophe that sealed his transformation into a barely recognizable figure. Dr. D, convinced that all illness originated from the mouth, decided to extract every single one of Louis XIV's teeth in a single barbaric session. There was no anesthesia, no proper surgical tools, just crude metal instruments and the cries of a 55-year-old king being brutally mutilated. The results were beyond grotesque. Dr. D managed to tear part of Louis's upper palate and fracture his lower jaw. This caused a permanent hole between his mouth and nasal cavity, so when the king tried to eat, food and wine would spray out through his nostrils. His speech became slurred, and courtiers had to lean in close to his putrid breath just to understand him. Saliva constantly dripped from his toothless mouth. Along with the anal fistula and his overwhelming weight, Louis XIV had gone from Europe's most desirable monarch to a drooling, obese, decaying mockery of royalty. But the most astonishing part of this decline was how desperately the court worked to maintain the illusion of his divine perfection. Versailles created over 200 new protocols to conceal the king's horrifying condition. A colour-coded system using silk ribbons was introduced to warn courtiers about Louis XIV's daily state. Red ribbons meant Get away, he's in pain. White ribbons meant approach with caution and wear aromatic masks, and black ribbons indicated that the king was having a particularly bad day with his bowel problems. The famous lever ceremony, once a 2-hour display of royal grandeur, was reduced to just 30 minutes to minimise exposure to the king's stench. During the couch air ceremony, Louis XIV was secretly fitted with cloth padding to absorb the constant leakage from his fistula. Thick curtains were drawn to hide the process of changing his soiled undergarments. Environmental adjustments were equally elaborate. Windows were strategically opened to create air currents that would blow the king's odour away from guests. Every hour, 500 bowls of fresh flowers were replaced throughout the palace, and 50 specialised perfume machines ran 24/7 to create clouds of scented smoke to mask the underlying stench of decay. Courtiers were instructed to carry ornamental balls filled with aromatic substances whenever they came near the king. Some visitors resorted to breathing through cloth soaked in perfume. These most delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves to vomit after meeting with Louis XIV, though they would blame their nausea on sudden feminine ailments rather than admit the truth. Foreign diplomatic relations began to suffer. Ambassadors found it increasingly difficult to endure long meetings with the French king. The English ambassador requested to conduct meetings outdoors for his health, while the Spanish representative began sending lower-ranking diplomats in his place. Some nations even questioned whether the Sun King was fit to rule if he couldn't even maintain basic bodily functions. Despite all this physical deterioration and the elaborate efforts to hide it, Louis XIV held on to his absolute power. The more his body failed him, the more desperately he clung to the myth of divine monarchy. Every ceremony, every protocol, every aspect of court life became a performance designed to obscure the fact that the king was literally rotting away before their eyes. But nothing prepared them for the horrors that awaited in his final month. The decay that consumed Louis XIV in 1715 would make everything that had come before seem like a minor inconvenience. What he endured in his last days would shock even the physicians who thought they had seen the worst of human decay. August 11th, 1715, 4:30 a.m., Louis XIV awoke with a scream of agony that shattered the pre-dawn silence of Versailles. His left leg felt like it was on fire, consumed by pain. Dr. Fagan, now 72 and nearly blind, was summoned immediately. His diagnosis? Sciatica, from too much sitting. The most incompetent physician in French history had just made his final, fatal mistake. What Dr. Fagan mistook for nerve pain was actually the beginning of senile gangrene, a condition that would devour Louis XIV alive over the next 3 weeks. By August 15th, black spots appeared on the king's big toe. By August 18th, the spots spread and his skin felt burning hot to the touch. By August 2nd, a new smell had emerged, not the familiar odour of pus and faeces, but something far worse. The unmistakable stench of rotting human flesh. By August 25th, even Dr. Fagan could no longer deny the truth. The black discoloration had spread halfway up the king's foot. The stench was so overpowering that servants were fainting when they entered the royal chamber. Modern medical experts later confirmed that Louis XIV was suffering from dry senile gangrene, poor circulation combined with infection that could have been treated with amputation. But who would dare suggest amputating the leg of a man who believed himself to be appointed by God? The horror of his condition accelerated daily. On August 28th, the big toe simply fell off while servants were changing the king's stockings. Courtiers collapsed at the sight of exposed bone. By August 30th, the gangrene had spread to his shin, and the stench now filled 3 floors of the palace. Yet incredibly, Louis XIV continued to rule. What makes his final decline so extraordinary is that he kept governing as his body literally rotted away. He signed royal decrees with a trembling hand while his flesh decomposed. Even in his final days, Louis XIV continued to meet with foreign ambassadors, while the unmistakable smell of death clung to him. He made military decisions with a voice growing hoarse as gangrene slowly crept up toward his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in horror, "The French king is dying slowly before our very eyes." The Austrian representative described the scene as the most gruesome spectacle they had ever witnessed. Yet still, the audiences went on. The business of absolute monarchy carried on, even as the king himself became a living corpse. Courtiers wore perfumed masks when they entered the king's presence, and the bed linens were changed every 2 hours to manage the leaking fluids. 20 servants worked in shifts to care for Louis XIV, but many requested transfers because they couldn't endure the stench. The odour was so powerful that it could be detected from the gardens of Versailles. Visitors could smell the Sun King's decay from hundreds of yards away. Foreign courts reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. Physicians travelled from across Europe, not to offer help, but simply to witness the unprecedented decline of a royal figure. Letters and diplomatic reports flew across the continent, detailing in gruesome detail how absolute monarchy was literally decomposing before the world's eyes. By August end, the gangrene had reached Louis XIV's calf, then his knee. Chunks of blackened flesh would fall away during the daily attempts to clean and bandage the affected areas. His leg looked like something from a battlefield, rotting tissue, exposed bone, and an infection that no medical treatment could stop. On September 1st, 1715, the final day, Louis could barely speak as gangrene spread to his throat muscles. He called his great-grandson to his bedside and whispered to him, "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." These were his last coherent words before the rot took away his ability to speak clearly. Sansimo, who was present during the final hours, recorded the king's death throes with chilling precision. At 11 p.m. on August 31st, Louis XIV entered the final stages of systemic gangrene. His body began to shut down as toxic tissue death spread through his left side. His last words, barely audible through his decaying throat, were, "Oh my God, come to my aid, hasten to help me." At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, the Sun King's heart finally stopped beating. But even in death, the horror continued. His body began to decompose with alarming speed. The infection that had ravaged him for weeks didn't stop just because his heart had stopped. Within hours, his bloated corpse swelled even further as bacterial gases built up inside. Dr. Marichal performed the royal autopsy just 6 hours after death, working desperately before the body became too decomposed for examination. His report, hidden for 200 years and discovered in 1801, revealed the full extent of the nightmare. The entire left side of Louis's body, from foot to head, was gangrenous. His skin had peeled off, his throat muscles were blackened with decay, and his intestines, twice their normal length, contained an unusually large tapeworm. The embalmers faced an impossible task. Louis XIV's body was decomposing too rapidly for normal preservation techniques. They worked with thick cloth masks soaked in perfume, but still, several assistants fled the room, overcome by nausea. The body was so corrupted that the embalmers had to rush through procedures that would usually take days. Even the funeral became a grotesque spectacle. The coffin had to be sealed immediately and reinforced with extra lead as the body continued to swell from the buildup of decomposition gases. During the lying in state, strange popping and gurgling sounds came from the sealed casket as the Sun King's corpse literally fell apart. The final cover-up was as elaborate as any during his life. Official reports declared that the king died peacefully after a brief illness. The truth, a 3-week ordeal of agonizing decay while the king remained conscious, was deemed too horrific for public knowledge. Within 48 hours of Louis XIV's death, a systematic destruction of evidence began. Dr. Fagan's medical records were burned, Dr. Felix's surgical diaries vanished for 300 years, and the autopsy report was hidden in secret archives until 1891. Import records for the vast amounts of perfume used to mask the king's decay were erased from official documents. The man who had styled himself as the Sun King, who believed in divine appointment and absolute authority, who built Versailles as a symbol of royal magnificence, died as a rotting, stinking mass of infected flesh. The ultimate irony was complete. The monarch who once believed himself to be godlike perished in a manner more degrading than the lowliest peasant, his body consumed by itself, while his mind remained trapped in the horror until the very end. Louis XIV, once called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, died in agonizing, putrid agony as his body literally consumed itself from within. The Sun King who built Versailles as a monument to divine monarchy ended his reign as a decomposing mass that horrified even his own physicians. Modern medical experts confirm what 17th century doctors refused to acknowledge. This could have been prevented. The anal fistula, basic hygiene, proper bathing, and early amputation could have saved his life. But the arrogance of absolute monarchy and the belief in divine royal immunity doomed Louis XIV to die like a diseased animal, refusing the medical help that could have spared him. The irony is almost unfathomable. The man who believed he was divinely appointed, who demanded unwavering obedience from millions, and who constructed the grandest palace in all of Europe, spent his final years as a decaying corpse, so much so that his own courtiers fled from his presence. The divine right of kings, which he once wielded with supreme authority, proved utterly powerless against the universal truth of human mortality. Louis XIV's legacy is not just a symbol of royal grandeur, it serves as a chilling reminder that absolute power has no defense against the inevitable decay of the human body. Thank you for watching.